So, yeah, maybe.
Oh, right.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so I mean, do this one too. I'm going to the office now because I can connect my email here, and then I'm gonna do that. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Christopher Watson from the Department of Physics. He's doing some interesting stuff in astronomy, which connects, which needs tools in data science. Today he's going to talk about a work jointly with Dr. Kathy Devin from College of Idaho, and he's going to talk about surface data science and wind-blown bubbles. So thanks a lot for being here, Jay.
Yeah. Let me clear out some of those. Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I wanted to talk today about a mix of things. It's about equal parts astronomy and computer science or computer programming, computer simulations, and then using data science tools to connect the computer simulations against some observations that were done as part of a large survey. So it's somewhat commonplace now to talk about data science dealing with very large data sets, and take a little pride in thinking that astronomy is on the cutting edge of that. There's a few different reasons for that, but it is now common when we have a new telescope or new satellite to not just have individual led projects where a person will use a telescope for like several nights, but instead the telescope or the satellite dedicates a large amount of time to some large survey to accomplish multiple goals. For example, the Spitzer Space Telescope was a satellite run by NASA where a large survey that I was heavily involved with did a survey of the Milky Way galaxy. So this was the satellite measured infrared light, and we pointed the survey all along the plane of the Milky Way galaxy, stitching the images together. And after about 3,000 hours of observing time, we get something like this. One of the principal justifications that we gave for a survey like this is that there are serendipitous discoveries, things that we didn't know were going to be there that become visible as we look carefully. In this case, one of the interesting objects were these shell type structures that you see right here. So these are we called wind-blown bubbles because we developed a model where a hot star, a massive star, was helping to create this through its ultraviolet radiation. I want to talk about today computer simulations to understand these wind-blown bubbles, and then data science tools that helped compare our computer simulations against our observations. Before I get to the computer simulations, I want to bring in a second complementary survey that was done. I was not personally involved in this survey. It's called the MALT 90 survey. It was done with a radio telescope down in Australia. The 90 stands for 90 gigahertz, the frequency of radio light that it observed. They took a different approach. Instead of using their telescope to do a complete survey of the whole Milky Way galaxy, they chose select positions that they thought would be especially interesting, where they thought stars would be forming, say. And they pointed the telescope at that position, indicated by the red dots, and then measured a wealth of molecular line emission. So they measured things like how much radio light was being produced by the molecule HMC or HCN or HCO plus, and then constructed a catalog of all their observations and made it publicly available. So I'm going to refer and use this catalog extensively, but before that, I want to go back to talking about these wind-blown bubbles. So this is an example of an especially dramatic wind-blown bubble called N49. So the green light here represents the observations done with the Spitzer Space Telescope at 8 microns. And the model, what we think is happening here, is shown in the cartoon, or the diagram on the right. So we have a massive star, something like 10 to 20 times the mass of our sun. And such a star will give off dramatically more ultraviolet light than our sun gives off. That ultraviolet light is very effective at pushing the surrounding gas away. So that creates a nearly evacuated cavity. And then that gas, as it gets blown further and further away, creates a dense shell surrounding the hot star. What was interesting about N49 when we first observed it was that this red light here represents 24 micron emission. And the gas, the ultraviolet light here shouldn't allow any particles that would produce 24 micron emission. Or at least in our very naive view, it shouldn't have allowed that. And so the problem that we aimed to solve is what's going on here? What is happening inside this evacuated cavity that allows 24 micron emission to be produced? And how can we model it in a sophisticated way? So the proposal that we had was that as the ultraviolet light pushes the gas away, it leaves a mostly evacuated cavity, but there are dense clumps that were especially dense and resist being destroyed or pushed away by the ultraviolet light. So they survive inside the cavity and are being evaporated by the ultraviolet light. So our goal is to see if this is right by modeling with computer simulations the dense clumps and then comparing our computer simulations against observations of the Malt 90 catalog using the tools of data science. So the dense clump, we simulate in the following way. We make some assumptions about the properties of the dense clump, how dense it is at the center, how large the dense clump is, and how much ultraviolet radiation is evaporating. We then break it up into cells and use the simulation software Astrochem to simulate the novel chemical pathways, the chemistry of the region. We get, we believe, some unusual chemicals, some unusual molecules over the course of about 100,000 years. We then take the results of those simulations, that chemistry, and plug it into a radiative transfer simulation called LINE. So that takes the chemistry, the molecules that exist all the way through the dense clump, and then it simulates what radiolight those molecules would produce and how effectively they would leave the dense clump. After doing that, we simulate in total how that radiolight would reach Earth, and we end up with a single prediction of which molecular emission lines we would expect to detect from such a dense clump. Now, our assumptions that we made in constructing the dense clump were broadly the central density of the dense clump, the size of the dense clump, and how strong the ultraviolet light was that was evaporating the dense clump. However, we would expect that those assumptions, our first guess, of course, would be wrong. So our goal is to redo the simulation many, many times, and then look at how the molecular line emission appears different at different, given the range of reasonable central densities, size, and ultraviolet radiation brightness. This is actually a pretty difficult calculation because we need to do so many of them. On a desktop computer, it would take several months to do all the combinations that I aimed to do. So instead of waiting several months, I set up the calculation using Google Compute. I created virtual machines that could, in a sense, check out a combination of density, size, and ultraviolet radiation, and then do the molecular line do all the simulations to get the brightnesses of different molecules. And then I had them all coordinating using a SQL server So they would deposit their results into the SQL server and then check out a new line. So all of them running in parallel allowed me to do 1,500 different environments and about 12 different molecules. Okay, so we now have our results. That is, we have computer simulations for different possible dense clumps, and we want to compare that against the MALT90 catalog. So the approach we took is the following. So the MALT90 catalog, that radio telescope that was pointed at 3,500 different sources scattered throughout the galaxy, and they measured 6 different molecular line strengths for each of those pointings, each location where maybe stars are forming. So our approach was the following. We went through the catalog and looked for which of those sources were associated with the bubbles, that are the windblown bubbles. Some of them, when we found them, were right on the rim of a bubble, suggesting maybe they're associated with the dense shell. Some of them were interior, suggesting that they are the evaporating bubble we expected. And then 90% of the sources were just not associated with bubbles at all. Our approach to try to better understand these windblown bubbles was to first categorize all the sources, and then to try to use a matching between the MALT90 catalog. Well, okay, so we first developed a simple nearest neighbor model, which took the molecular line strengths, and our goal was to be able to predict whether, based on the molecular line strengths, we could correctly predict if the source was associated with the rim of a bubble, associated with the interior of a bubble, or not associated with a bubble. So the nearest neighbor model is a very simple model. Briefly, the way that it works is once you train the model, or once you design the model, you give it a source. That is, you give it a set of line brightnesses, and it looks for other sources in its system that are nearest or most similar. It looks for what those sources were categorized as, and then gives you basically a majority rule. So in 2 dimensions, if you only have 2 line strengths, you can think of it as drawing a circle and looking at which sources are interior, how many sources in the circle are interior, how many sources are rim, and whichever is the most common categorization produces the prediction for whether it will be rim or interior or not. We used the 5 closest sources as a way to categorize. This was a sanity check. It's a first pass to see if using molecular line strengths is at all hopeful. You have a question, I can tell.
Yes.
Oh, shoot.
Right now?
Yeah, if you want.
Okay, you in the previous slides, you draw like H and C molecule, hydrogen isocyanate.
Okay.
Yes, and now I see actually HCl.
We use both.
Yes, and my question would be like later, how did you identify what is who is who?
They have different, they emit different radio frequencies.
And different rhythm.
So that's, yeah.
Yes.
Slightly different, not dramatically different, but not the same.
Okay. Continue.
Oh, that was easy. Okay. Okay, so as a sanity check, we can turn this model back on itself. That is, say, okay, let's pick a source from the catalog, use the other sources in the catalog to see if, with this method, we can predict the rim interior not associated model, and you get a confusion matrix that looks like this. So the true observed properties are located along the horizontal axis, and our model's predictions are located along the vertical axis. So if a source really is associated with the interior, and our model successfully predicts it as interior, that gets put into the 84 number right here. If, on the other hand, the source is not associated with the bubble at all, but our model predicts it as being interior, that would be, for example, in the 153 number right here. So we can broadly say that this based on this column here, that the interior category is 89% complete. What that means is that in the whole catalog, when we do this method, the sources that truly are interior, we capture 89% of them in the yeah, that's right. We capture 89% of them in the predicted category of interior, and then the complementary the row here, our category interior is only 34% accurate. So 34% is a pretty small number. Unfortunate. However, I think that is a deceptively low number for the following reason. The goal here is to look at the molecular lines and try to infer something about the physical environment that produces those molecular lines. We think, for a variety of reasons, based on the chemistry and the radiation, that a combination of high density and strong ultraviolet light can create unusual molecules and unusual emissions. So one way to accomplish high density and strong UV light is in these windblown bubbles. But nature, the universe, is a creative place. So there may be many other types of environments where you would have a combination of high density and strong UV light over a long enough time period to produce these interesting molecular lines. That sort of environment would then be the machine learning system, the model would predict it as interior, and even if it's not created in a windblown bubble. So in a sense, these sources, the 153 sources here, might be the most interesting sources to look at because they may tell us other environments where the unusual combination of high density and strong UV light are doing something fun. Okay, my goal in designing this model was to be able to compare the computer simulations against the observations. So I trained the model on the observations for which we knew which ones we could see which ones were associated with the rim or interior or not associated. We can then take that model and turn it onto our simulations. We have simulations where we have, for example, the first row, a certain density, a certain size, a certain UV radiation that's evaporating the dense core, and then we have the simulated molecular line emission. If we turn our model and that simulated molecular line emission, we can then predict whether that source would be categorized as rim or interior or none. We did that for all our sources, threw out the none, and then grouped together the sources categorized as rim and the other sources categorized as interior, and then looked at the general properties of the rim sources and the interior sources. For the interior sources, we see that there's a wide range of densities, and the outer radius tends to be on the longer side. And the radiation field here is relatively, it's not excessively large. So a typical radiation field in the galaxy in this scale is 1. We would expect them to be higher, and they are, but not orders of magnitude higher. More interesting are the sources that that the model categorized as rim. So those sources are preferentially high density. That is something that we would expect. That is, this dense shell, we would naively, I think, or potentially, but we would expect that this dense shell creates an environment where the dense cores can be especially dense because it's dense over a very long time period. And so that is, I think, somewhat comforting to get that result. The outer radii also, however, appears to be somewhat large. That, I think, is harder to understand why the dense shell would create an environment where you get especially large clumps. So that, I think, deserves more careful thought. The radiation field is similar. Okay, so I claimed that that was a simple model to compare our computer simulations against the Mult 90 observations. I want to present a somewhat more sophisticated, complex model, and that's a neural network. So we start with the same approach, where we have the Molt-90 catalog that has a bunch of sources. Each source we've measured molecular line strengths and categorized the source as rim, interior, or none. So I designed a neural network to then predict, to use this as data for predicting categorization. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about neural networks, but briefly, the network starts with 6 nodes here. Each node corresponds to a molecular line strength. That is basically the line strength that from the observations is fed into each node. That each node then is connected to the layer beneath. So the first layer here, the first node is connected to all the nodes of the input layer. And by that, I mean the number in this node is a weighted sum of the 6 nodes in the input layer. The weights that we choose for that weighted sum are something that we have to adjust carefully by training. I'll return to that idea later. If that weighted sum is a positive number, it then gets passed on to the layer below. If it's a negative number, it gets the node value gets reset to 0. So different weighted sums are created in each node. And physically, the idea here is we're looking for unusual combinations of line strengths that might tell us this source is interior, this source is rim, this source is none. And the idea of training is that the training process is looking for potentially interesting combinations. Historically in astronomy, this was done with like 3 different line strengths where you would plot one ratio against another ratio and look for regions that you could say like class 1, class 2, class 3. But when we get to 6, that's getting a little more difficult. And so this sort of structure potentially could be rewarding. So we have a couple layers of this process combining line strengths. We end with an output layer where there's 3 nodes. Those nodes are restricted to have numbers between 0 and 1. Each node corresponds to one of those categories, and we interpret it as the probability. That is, this might be the probability that the source should be classified as rim. This is the probability of interior. This is the probability of none. And of course, we enforce the restriction that they add up to 1. Okay, so the training process is subtle because to a 90% accuracy, bubbles don't exist. That is, most of these sources are not bubble associated. And so it is, for the training, when you're trying to figure out the weights, most of the time, if you just let it go, it'll say none of these, they're all not bubble associated, or it'll have a very hard time finding the interior and the rim, the most interesting sources. So in order to fight that natural inclination, we overweighted the sources that were categorized as rim or interior. And the idea was that we wanted to value more the completeness and the accuracy of the interior category and the rim category. And then we wanted to give less weight to the accuracy and completeness of the non-bubble, non-associated category. So the combination of accuracy and completeness is combined into something called F1. And so the sources that were categorized as rim and interior, we gave more weight to during the training process. And I found that the appropriate balance that would get us the most gain on the interior and rim categories with the least amount of loss from the none categories was a weight of 7.5. So the training process is subtle and dangerous. So what I took a standard approach where of the 3,500 sources, I broke it up into thirds. And the first third I used for training. That is, I used those sources and adjusted the weights in the weighted averages to try to determine what combinations would give the best prediction. I then also checked that model against the last third, but the standard practice is to not use that last third as a feedback to change the weights. You just use it to check. And the idea is if you only use the first 2 thirds, for adjusting the weights, and your accuracy and completeness gets dramatically better in the first 2/3, but doesn't get better in the last third, then you're overfitting. You're training something that will only work on the data that you're using and won't be generalizable. So I did that, and the accuracy and completeness improved as we changed the weights. The last third is the accuracy and completeness, the F1 scores, shown here, and that's dangerously lower than the training set, indicating that we may be overfitting. However, I actually rotated it around the third. I trained on the first 2/3, did it once, then trained on the second and third, using the first third for validation, and then did it a third time. So that got me a range, and that's shown in the shaded region around the lines, and that shows some overlap. So it's potential, we might not be in as much trouble as you might initially expect. The bubble rim shows no significant overfitting. So the rim looks okay. If we take our best model and turn it back on itself to create a confusion matrix, we get something like this. And so we have something similar. Our completeness is significantly lower than it was. Our accuracy is not great. However, the qualification I made before stands, that the low accuracy might be because the 182 number here is actually the most interesting stuff, potentially. The other thing I want to point out here is that, of course, we're fighting the fact that 90% of our sources are not bubble associated, and we're looking for the 5% that are rim and the 5% interior, and that's hard. However, if you concentrate on the lower right corner of this confusion matrix, you'll notice we're really good at distinguishing interior from rim. That is, if I'm given a source and I know that it's either interior or rim, the model would work quite well, which tells us that the molecular line strengths of rim and interior sources are different, which probably tells us the physics, the astronomy, the science is different, and that this approach might help us in as we apply it to our computer simulations. So neural networks are, I think, somewhat infamous for being black boxes and not to be trusted unless you can understand the underlying physics. And so I try to share that wariness. So it is, I want to try to understand what the neural network is doing that leads us to have some confidence in distinguishing. One approach is to plot line strengths against each other. We have 6 line strengths for these sources. So we can't plot them all simultaneously, but we can pairwise them up. That is, I can take HCN and HC3N, measure the line strengths for a single source. I can plot it as its HC3N line strength against its HCN line strength. That gets me a single dot here. I shade the dot according to whether it's orange is not bubble associated, rim is green, and blue is interior. The dots overlap each other. That a more elegant way of looking at this is you construct contours instead of dots, and that makes it a little easier. And you'll notice that the not bubble associated, the orange, has a range of properties, and the rim has a more coherent pattern to it. The interior is in blue, which is kind of buried underneath that. So, but there are patterns here. It's not a pattern that you could then say a source right here is guaranteed to be a rim, because the not bubble associated are also present at any one location. However, I will claim that there are enough patterns that are sometimes much more narrow or well developed for rim or interior compared to not bubble associated, that the neural network has some justification when it notices enough of these patterns to build up a probability that a single source might be rim or might be interior. We can try to work through the weights to see if we can trace out this same pattern, specifically HNC and HC3N. This is, let me just briefly mention this. Okay, so the last layer of the network predicts, say, bubble rim. It does so using a weighted sum of the previous layer. You can visualize that weighted sum, each of those weights, each of those numbers as a color, and these would be the resulting colors that create the weighted sum to predict bubble rim. The strongest, the most negative in this case, is associated with node 0 of layer 3. If you concentrate only on that, node 0 of layer 3 is connected to all the nodes of layer 2. You can visualize those weights, again, as colors. 4, 10, and 26 are the strongest. You trace that back, 4, 10, and 6. You can continue on and trace back, and it appears that 4, 10, and 6 mostly connect with the molecular lines HC3N and HCN. We're ignoring many connections in this process, but the strongest ones do appear to be related to the patterns that we roughly see in the contour plots. Okay, the third network model I wanted to develop is related, but somewhat separate. And it's actually what I went to Alessandro to ask about earlier in the semester. So the bubbles that we identified, the wind blown bubbles, were constructed, a catalog of 5,000 of them was constructed by amateur astronomers. It was a citizen science project. And as someone designed a website, showed people an image from the glimpse survey, and asked, do you see any bubbles in this? If you do, circle them. That's wonderful because you get a huge number of person hours to work on it, but it's of course like unreproducible. I mean, no one's ever going to be able to do that again easily. And it would be nice to have a model that would do it in a more controlled way. So that's a classic image segmentation problem. You have an image, which pixels in this image are ones that you would associate with a bubble, which pixels are associated with nothing. So my goal was to develop such an image segmentation model. There are several reasons why you would want to do this aside from just being more reproducible. The images that are presented to people tend to be single color, that is just 8 micron, where bubbles are most obvious, or maybe 3 different colors, because you can create RGB images relatively easily. But a neural network, you can input as many different colors as the physics allows and finds interesting. So since that catalog was constructed, the surveys have been constructed out of more than just the 8 micron wavelength at which bubbles were discovered. So let me zoom in here. So at 5.8 microns, we see a bubble here and kind of a dim bubble there. At 8 microns, it becomes a little more obvious. Since this time, though, we've also done a survey at 12 microns. There's the 24 microns, which picks out the interior. And the Europeans were nice enough to do a 70 micron survey that they've also made public. So the goal was to use all of these because each may make it more accurate, it gives us more information to identify the bubbles. As a target, I used the already existent 5,000 bubbles from the Citizen Science Project. So the idea is on those images, I created a target mask where everything was 0 except where the pixels associated with bubbles I categorized as 1. And then I did that for the whole galaxy. And the goal was to take the data and try to design a neural network that matches those masks. So a standard model that would accomplish such a goal is called a UNet model. I will only briefly describe it. The idea is we start with an input of the 5 different wavelengths. Each channel, each wavelength is 1024 by 1024 pixels. And the model here will do something called a convolution, a two-dimensional convolution, where it looks for initially simple structures, like vertical lines or horizontal lines or diagonal lines. And if it finds such structure, it does so, it looks for those structures. Then, so that's one layer. It then, after finding such structures, it looks for more complex structures, maybe like half circles. And as you go deeper into the network, it looks for more and more complex structures. Which structures it looks for is based on a training process. The idea is that the training process, it'll guess and check which sort of weights to use, which sort of structures are most productive in this case, identifying bubbles. So that's the first half of the model. The second half of the model tries to associate those complex structures with different parts of the image. We end up with a final output, which is one channel wide, 1024 by 1024 pixels. Each pixel has a number between 0 and 1. That number represents the probability that that pixel is bubble associated. So I would describe, so I designed such a model and started training it on the bubbles. The bubble catalog. This is dramatically more computationally intensive than the earlier models I described. So just sending the catalog, training the model on all the data and the whole catalog simultaneously is not yet practicable. There are all sorts of unique difficulties in applying this sort of data to astronomy. I mean, one is the 5 channels instead of the 1 or 3 that is most common from like a cell phone camera. But there's other problems too, like the signal to noise in astronomy observations are dramatically higher than the signal to noise like in a cell phone camera picture. Also, the random Poisson noise in the background of an image is something that's not present in cell phone camera pictures. So those sorts of problems have to be treated delicately. I've made some progress, but it's still under development. So I've trained on 40 bubbles successfully, and by that I mean this 8 micron data along with the other channels the model will produce this sort of prediction, where these are the locations of the bubbles. That's the binary. If instead we want to look at the probabilities of each pixel, that's this grayscale here, and you can see a nice sharp rise from background 0 to bubble associated. As a sample, I can show you some other sources there where there are some successes and what's the term? Not failures, points where we still need to work. So like these 2 bubbles do come out. Some of the structure might be truly there and interesting, but then there is potentially some infestation of what is probably just stellar light that is difficult to distinguish from a bubble. So although we do have some successes, these are stars that are bright, that nicely are removed in this prediction. So key takeaways here. We have computer simulations of the chemistry and the radiation of dense cores, and we have used a nearest neighbor and a neural network to compare those simulations against observations in the 90 catalog. And it appears that those models successfully distinguish rim and interior sources. The rim sources appear to be especially dense and especially large. The convolutional neural network described right at the end here shows promising success in being able to identify bubbles and hopefully can identify a wider range of images than maybe people would consider, citizen scientists would consider interesting. So why don't I stop there and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank for the very interesting talk. Are there questions or comments? Hand raised now. Let me see.
Let me-
if you haven't. Yeah. Maybe I'll stop sharing the screen.
Yeah.
Let's see. Ivan, can you hear us? Maybe we waited too long. Huh? Yes, please.
So the layers there was 4 layers. So for the first one, the one that I have more confidence in. There's a skip connection. I ignored that unless you caught the yeah. I mostly ignored describing that. But 4 layers, like so 6 to 64, and then cutting down to 3. The image segmentation, the UNet. I have many layers. It's like, so I mean, I gather that
deep.
yes, very deep. So, like there's 9 rounds, but each round consists of a couple convolutions, and then a dropout, and then a downsampling. And then you have to repeat that process going on. That makes me uncomfortable. And I would like to, as one plan going forward, is to try to cut out some of those layers. But we run into this problem that bubbles can be, say, 20 pixels wide or 500 pixels wide. And so the shape here can either be very narrow or very large. And my understanding of those convolutional neural networks is that it would be there's not a good reason to believe that they would identify something large unless you downsample quite a bit. So I'm skeptical that we would be able to get large bubbles identified successfully without having a deep network. Although I'm willing to be convinced otherwise if it works.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Actually, I was really fascinated with the compound.
Huh.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm chemist.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I talked about molecules.
Yes, exactly. And some of the how this patterns with how molecules were like, for example, HCl and H3N were the most existent.
Yes.
That is actually made for me much more sense than HMC isocyanide. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so you probably know more about this than I do. I would
Yeah.
love to hear about why you're surprised by one more than the other.
Okay, yes, it was like, yes, exactly. So for me, it's chemical logic, the existence of the first 2 molecules is much more because of stability. HCl, HMC, it is actually much less stable
Okay.
neutral molecule than HCl.
Yeah.
That's why I was like in the first.
So what's the principal mechanism of
Okay,
instability?
Let's go to the other question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
We can discuss this in
Yeah.
private.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fair enough.
Okay, so basically, did anyone, and you pretty clear explained the conditions in which this basically molecule can be created. It is high pressure.
Take that as a compliment. Thank you.
Yes, and you did. And my next question will be, did anyone try to repeat this condition?
Did anyone try to repeat what?
Conditions on the Earth?
Oh, no. Yeah, no. I have not seen these sort of simulations in a lab. I mean, this is all by lab standards. This is a vacuum. Like
It's
it's
like that lab experience.
no. Yeah, no. I think that's. I mean, so the densities here, like the area that I call dense, is perhaps deceptive, because in this field of astronomy, dense is like 1 million total particles per cubic centimeter.
Doesn't tell me.
Um,
It's like
Okay.
it's about like stability for you.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's a strong vacuum. By like a laboratory environment, it's an extremely strong vacuum. And the timescales here, when I said 100,000 years, that wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was literally the chemistry was simulated over like that timescale. And so I would expect it would be challenging to confirm like such yeah, it'd be I would expect that combination of the high vacuum and the long time.
Yes, and the UV, this is like
Oh, the UVs. Yeah, the UV is fine. Like that's
yeah,
not hard.
but it's not almost like have enough equipment.
Okay, it could be that it could be I'm naive. So
People actually try to,
I haven't seen.
and because of the very, my opinion.
Okay.
And very good support or
Yeah, no, that's
disapproval of what
Yes.
is done.
yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, please.
So, Max, you did two things. One was using spectroscopy to identify what is the source. And the second one is identify shapes.
Yeah, that seems
Is
fair.
that what you did? Okay, so.
I mean, running the computer simulations is
Yes.
like if like
You
yeah.
did that based on real data. Not on simulations. At least the shape ones, they were based on
Yes.
data.
yeah.
So from observation, not from simulations, because what I want to do for me is, on the other hand, going from simulations, so it's a much larger catalog,
Yeah.
but probably sharper contrast between stuff and what is known. So I will need to talk to you and see what you think is going to be the challenge. Also for me, shapes is three-dimensional shapes. So what you think is going to be with 3Ds?
So, I mean, the standard way of approaching 3 dimensions is, to do a 3-dimensional simulation. I didn't make a big deal about the dense clumps, but I enforced a spherical symmetry in those, because that makes the simulation process dramatically more efficient. So it also reduces the parameter space. You have just a single size scale or radius. Once you introduce truly 3-dimensional non-symmetric shapes, your parameter space explodes. And each simulation is dramatically higher. Or it's dramatically more difficult because it can't exploit that symmetry to reduce the simulation time. So I mean, what I did that would take the equivalent of several months on a desktop computer would explode to much larger numbers, which would scare me.
Yeah. Planning for the far future.
Yeah. I mean, in 10 years, you do it on a single desktop computer, I'm sure.
Oh,
Said that, but where did you do the computation? You just said several months on a desktop.
It's the equivalent of that. I did it on Google Compute. So Google Compute, you can sign up for an account. You can create virtual machines and install software in a way that's similar that you would install on a desktop computer. And so I did all that. I did it all on a virtual machine at Google, on Google Compute.
do you need to pay for it?
Yeah.
So that could be done with grants instead of buying a
Right. Yeah.
machine, you just buy machine.
Yeah. And of course, like you pay for what you use. You don't pay for what you don't use. And if you just wait a year, all the computers get better and you can just sign up for a faster computer. I mean, for example, my development was on like a slow computer that was nearly free. And that confirmed that everything worked. And then when I really wanted to do computations fast, I spin up a faster computer with the same virtual machine. So in some sense, I mean, I found it as a toy amazing.
Well, talk to me and Alessandro about some of that. And the other thing is, you contact with okay.
Oh, I have. So some of this, yeah, I haven't. So, but you mean for computational resources?
Not, they have like supercomputer.
I would love to be introduced if you have contacts there.
Yes.
Other questions or comments? Anybody from the audience, students especially? From the online audience? No? Wow, then let's thank Crystal again for the very interesting talk. Thank you very much for being
Thank you.
here. Thank you. So I'm closing, I'm stopping the recording now.